joining me now on the Knicks Film School Podcast. If you were a really dedicated fan, you will have seen this person in uniform, a New York Knicks uniform, about 13 years ago when he had a cup of coffee in training camp with the team. He is probably better known over the years for being the son of Ernie Grunfeld, of course, famed Knick. He had a lot of roles with the team, but obviously the GM when they had their rise to prominence in the 90s. And most recently, he is the author of By the Grace of the Game, The Holocaust, A Basketball Legacy, and an Unprecedented American Dream. Coming out November 16th in bookstores everywhere. Dan Grunfeld. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Doing great, man. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And if you remember me wearing a Knicks jersey, you are a committed fan.
I mean, listen, who doesn't Google themselves to this day? If you Google Dan Grunfeld, one of the first images that comes up is you, number 9. There you go.
Listen, I'm not deleting that photo. I want it up there.
Well, I want to talk. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about the book because I just think, there is literally one person that could have written this story, and it is you, because this is as unique a story as you are ever going to come across. And the perspective that you have, having grown up in obviously your family with your dad and everything, I'm excited to hear about that. But listen, we brought it up already, so let's go back in time to 2008. So you had been playing professionally for a little bit, right? Overseas. Tell me what that was like. Did you get a call like, hey, we want you to come to the team? How'd that go?
So it was after my second year, and I was playing in Spain, and I had a really good year. I led my team in scoring. I was kind of like, hitting my stride. I was on the rise, and I had a bunch of workouts scheduled for NBA teams, but I had a bone spur in my ankle. So I missed every workout except one, which happened to be the Knicks. So for me, having grown up around the Knicks, obviously I know the organization well, but at that point I was just a pro, and I was like, hey, I'm trying to, make it to the league. And so I went to the Knicks practice facility for this kind of 3-day mini camp. And I tell this story in the book. And, they had the list of the teams on the whiteboard. There was I think there were 19 players and really top level players in Europe. And my name there was one team with an extra person, and my name was the extra one, so I kind of looked at that like, oh, okay. My dad was the GM of the team. It kind of I was like, okay, am I a favorite here? I ended up leading the camp in scoring, not because I was mad, right? I think that helped, but ultimately I hit my stride, but I was a little, annoyed by that, and had a really strong camp. And Donnie Walsh was the GM. He invited me to training camp. And so, it just so happened that it was the Knicks. For me, it could have been, it was a coincidence, but it was a happy one because, we'll get into it, all the history my family has with the team, man. I wouldn't have had it any other way.
It's funny. We just had this, obviously this great season, which everybody's excited about, now transitioning to the year 2 with the Thibodeau era and everything. I still have very fond memories of Donnie Walsh. I remember when Donnie first came here, he came with that level of I almost want to say a level of gravitas, a level of respect 100%. Around the league. What did you know Donnie? I mean, I'm sure you had come across him at some point over the course of your life.
I did know him a bit. My dad and him had a really good relationship. He's a gentleman, obviously very knowledgeable about the game of basketball, but just, ton of respect. He's widely respected around the league. And so I always enjoyed my time around him, treated me great. He did a great job, and he brought a lot of talent to the team. So when I was there, it was Mike D'Antoni's first year. Yep. And, the team didn't necessarily fit together well, but I mean, you had Jamal Crawford, you had Zach Randolph, you had David Lee. There was a lot of really strong talent there. So it was a great experience, man.
We were just reminiscing before you came on and we started recording, and I asked Andrew, I'm like, I'll give you a $10 if you could remember who led the team in scoring that year. And of course, Andrew right away, Al Harrington. I would not have remembered it was Al Harrington. I probably would have gone with David Lee. No, but Al was a nice talent. So yeah, no, but obviously that was the kind of the cup of coffee you had in the NBA, but you had a really long and successful career. I mean, after obviously what was a fantastic time at Stanford, I feel like, sometimes we forget that the NBA is only one professional league, or some people do, maybe not everybody. Overall, would you say you were, you were happy with how your career turned out as a pro?
100%. I mean, listen, I suffered a very bad injury at Stanford. I was the second leading scorer in the Pac-10. I tore my ACL right at the end of the season. Tiger Woods sitting courtside, nationally televised games. It was really dramatic injury. So that altered the course of my career. But to your point, like, and me growing up, my dad played in the NBA, worked in the NBA. That's all I had my sights set on. So I remember when I got my first contract overseas, I didn't know what that meant. And I almost considered it like a failure. But once you get over there and you realize how high the level is, ultimately you're playing professional basketball, doing what you always dreamed of doing. You're just doing it in a little bit of a different way. And then personally, like, broadened my horizon so much, man, living all around the world, different cultures, different people. Also learned a lot about basketball because, like, the game is played differently. So just like broadened my horizons in so many ways. So I wouldn't trade it.
What do you think is the biggest difference from playing overseas to how the game is played here?
Oh, man.
And I know the game I think if you compare the game the way it was played in the late, a mid to late aughts, versus now, I kind of think we've embodied here in America some of the principles that, maybe after they started whooping our butts in the Olympics or international competition. I shouldn't specify the Olympics.
I think that it has been a little bit more international of late. I'll tell you, like, if I had to pinpoint one thing, the game overseas is more physical. The referees call it differently, but that has a ripple effect because there's less space. You can't do as much off the dribble because defenders are able to kind of put their hands on you a little more. So that really changes how the game is played and, like, what you put value on. So the dribble is valued less, the pass is valued more. Just the way the game is played is different. It's also it's highly team oriented. Not to say that, but, like, I grew up in the United States AAU, right? Like, I was trying to score and get buckets. Yes, I wanted to win, of course, and I ultimately was a team player. But, like, we have a little bit more of an individualistic culture, which is why we have the best players, right? Like, overseas, they're highly, highly committed to the team game. So, like, you might be the best player on the team, but you're playing 25 minutes, just like everyone else, so it's kind of like a little bit more distributed, but yeah, man, it's definitely a learning curve when you first get over there, but there's a lot to learn.
Well, you obviously did well, got a long career over there. And then, fast forward to now, and it's 2021. This book is coming out in about a month and a half. I guess I want to start with, like, where was the inspiration? I mean, obviously you have this one of a kind tale, and we'll get into it in a bit, but at what point was it like, what, I should put pen to paper and actually tell this story?
Totally, man. Like, I've always loved to write, and so I think writing is just something that's kind of inside you that if you love to do it, it's almost like you can't not do it. And I've always been like that. So people knew I played basketball, but after practice, I would come home and write stories and write poems and things like that. My parents could have told you that. It was always kind of like something I really loved to do. And when I was playing, I had contributing writing positions to several websites. So just kind of exercising that muscle. But I always knew there was kind of like this white whale project, which was this book. And
and you knew it was this story is what you wanted to tell. I knew it was
this story, man, because I lived this story and I always felt like the profound impact of it. And I thought, man, this is an important story to tell, not just for me, but I think, it's relatable because it's a story of overcoming adversity, family, legacy, love, and these things are kind of universal. And so I was like, man, that would be my dream, is just to tell this story, but it is very big. So I knew it would take a long time. It would just take a lot. And after I retired, I went to business school, which gave me some space to explore some things. And I said, you know what, now's the time. And so I did. I spent a year and a half doing the research. I spent 8 months writing the first draft, where I got up at 6 in the morning every morning to do it. So, like, and it's funny because I said to my wife, this isn't going to happen casually. I have to approach this like I approach basketball, and with hoops, like,
sure,
my whole schedule was revolved around the game. So I said, I have to approach this really surgically. So yeah, set my alarm, got up, just like approached it like basketball. And 8 months later, I had my first draft.
So you mentioned, it's funny, I was just about to ask about this. You mentioned the research. I'm curious, how does one go about doing research for a book that is primarily, if I understand it correctly, about your family and your family history? Like, how much did you know going in, and like where did you want to fill in the gaps and know you needed to fill in the gaps?
For sure. I knew the high level story, right? Because my dad is the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. So both of his parents are Holocaust survivors. My grandmother, I live in the Bay Area. She lives 25 minutes away from me. She came to every single home game I played at Stanford. We talk every day. We've always been extraordinarily close. She's as sharp as a tack at 96. Like, her memory is unbelievable. So there's a lot to extract there. So while I knew the high level details, we never really dug into specifics. And I don't just mean about her. Sure. I mean all her family and my grandfather's family and what happened, where, when, at the same time with my dad, because, my dad doesn't talk much about this background. In my book, I discussed the notion of privilege a lot, and I'm privileged in a lot of different ways. One of them is that I have a generation of separation. My dad was born under communism in Romania. And of course, we'll get to this, but people know Ernie Grunfeld in New York as a Knick. He was a New York City basketball legend, but my dad has a background that people really don't know about. And there's a lot of difficult stuff there. And so he doesn't talk about it much, So talking to my dad and drawing out some of the things that he went through before he came to America. And then, piecing those things together, talking to other family, doing some research, about from sources just to understand the history. It was a project. It was a big project.
I mean, it's just, no matter what life you lead, right? Like, you led a life growing up with a dad who run a basketball team, but you could, you could have a father or a mother that's a teacher or a fireman or whatever. Like, you don't come home and sit at the dinner table and go to your dad or your mom. Like, so tell me about, 20 years ago when, like those conversations don't happen organically. And it's funny because I think we think sometimes that like people in other households, they've delved into all this stuff, but that's not reality. So I imagine the process of, well, you tell me, was getting your dad to sit down and really have these conversations with you, was that in and of itself a challenge, or how was that process?
That process was okay because we're very close. We talk every day anyway. And I just kind of said, I didn't even tell him what I had in mind necessarily. I just said, listen, I want to make sure this history is memorialized. Let's just talk about it. And so I was in school and so we kind of set time every day. I just call him after class. I'd have a recorder. I'd transcribe the conversations and we just chat, and of course I know about his experience in the Olympics and I know what it was like for him to immigrate. And, my dad, when he got to America, he lost his brother to leukemia less than a year after they got here. And that's a very big tragedy in my family, so that's my dad doesn't like to talk about that. So that's a hard thing to kind of draw out, but he did, he talked to me about the different aspects of his life and playing at Tennessee and the Knicks and just the whole thing. And literally it was over a year of just and it was actually really fun, because I got to know my dad better.
I was about to say, you guys probably got closer, right?
Yeah. Like, how often do you talk to your parents about what they were doing in high school? It's not something that, or like, what was summer camp like? Like, that kind of stuff doesn't come up much. So, and particularly with his journey and how unique it's been and how much he does not like to talk about it. There were some things that came out, and even to this day, things come out that I'm like, whoa, I didn't know that. So it was meaningful.
Do you, I could tell just from hearing you talk about it, what you got out of it. Do you have any idea like what your dad got out of this process talking to you about this stuff?
I think it's cathartic in a way, to have a safe space to share details that maybe you don't talk about a lot, so I think that while it was hard and there's a lot of really hard stuff, like there's really hard stuff in the book, there's also really triumphant stuff, because listen, where my dad came from and where he got, it's really unbelievable. And so you can celebrate that, but you also have to look back at some of the things that happened, which are really, really hard. My dad never had grandparents. All of his grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. My grandmother lost 5 siblings in the Holocaust. My dad lost his brother. This is really serious stuff, but my book and in my life, man, this is the life I've lived where like basketball for my family did things that were incredible. You like the power of a game to change generations of a family just because, from where my dad came and then he found basketball and it gave him a new life, so it was kind of that story I was really trying to tell. And it's really the story I've lived.
It's amazing. It's amazing hearing you talk about this. We're so far removed from that. I don't know if you know this, I also teach, and like I've taught like Holocaust units in school, and you try to explain this to people, the young people nowadays. And it's not, I don't know. I feel like it doesn't always register. And I don't know that it registered for me when I was growing up, because I was, whatever it was, 50 years removed from it. But I guess for you, because we're about the same age, growing up in your family, like how cognizant were you of the real history, and how, like, obviously I'm sure you knew what happened, but how it touched your family and like the emotional impact that had? Like, were you cognizant of that growing up?
I was aware, but as I got older and more mature, you kind of understand the gravity of it, but I was aware at a fairly young age. My grandma, we've always been really close. She talks with a heavy accent, and listen, when your loved ones tell stories about people who are no longer around, you kind of understand what happened a little bit. And, there's a saying, like, it feels so foreign to us now in 2021 in the United States of America. But my grandmother, again, she's 96. Like, I will talk to her tonight when we hang up, when we stop talking. Like, she was there. She survived. Much of her family was not able to. So it's like, it wasn't that long ago and it wasn't that far away. You know what I mean? That's the reality of it. And, my first year professionally, I played in Germany, which was also a whole different thing. And I said this, like, I'm probably the only professional basketball player who had to call his grandmother to ask permission, which I did. My agent said, "Hey man, I got a great opportunity for you." And I was psyched. I was like, "Let's do it, man. I'm ready to roll. Yeah. Tell me where I'm there." He's like, "Germany." I was like, "Hold on a second." Like, the first thing that came to my mind was, I have to call my grandma. And so I called her, and, she didn't hesitate. I said, I have an opportunity, but there's a problem. And she said, "What's the problem?" I said, "It's in Germany." She said, "There's no problem." She said, "Sons are not responsible for the sins of their father." She said, "You go, you enjoy." My grandmother's the most amazing person. And listen, when we played in Nuremberg in Germany, we went by the site of the Nuremberg rallies, which were these famous, Nazi rallies. And in Berlin, we went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And, there was like a reconciliation for me, at the time, because listen, obviously that history is well known. So, it's always been a thread throughout my life, knowing what happened. And as I got older, understanding it more. And this book is really the culmination, because now I really know. I really know what happened to my grandmother's siblings and her parents. And but it's always been a history that's been part of my life.
I don't want to spoil too much of the book because, again, it's out for anybody who missed it at the beginning, November 16th. I'm sure you could pre-order now. I think any book you pre-order.
100%. Anywhere you get books. We're trying to support local bookstores. So go to your local bookstore and pick up a copy, but definitely available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
So, but I do want to touch on your dad a little bit more. So, you mentioned it a few times, Olympic gold medalist. What can you tell us about what it was like for him? Again, his journey to this country and kind of what that meant to him to then, carry the flag and have that medal slipped around his neck.
Extraordinarily meaningful. And it's funny, if you ask, like, what does it mean to my dad? My dad was a kid who came to America, who didn't speak English. Parents were Holocaust survivors, have to work for basically 7 days a week. And then his brother passed away. So he has this really tough background. He just went to the park in Forest Hills, Queens to make friends and learn English. And then he started playing hoops. And then he was good. And then he was really good. And then he was really, really good. So for him, basketball was just an escape, and I grew up always thinking I'd play in the NBA, my dad just played hoops just because that's all there was. And I write a story in the book where my grandparents, they never saw my dad play basketball till he was a junior in high school. And they got a call at their fabric store. His high school coach said, "You're going to want to see this guy play. He's pretty good." And so they shut their store down, which had never happened before. Like the idea of them shutting down their fabric store, didn't exist. Right. So they go to see him, and, my grandfather would make him come to the store and work. And after the game, he told him right on the court, "You never have to come again. You just play basketball." And
I guess he had a good game.
Listen, dude, he was already like all city, and then the next year he's an All-American. He's one of the highest recruited players in the country. So his evolution just kind of happened, and he was off to the races. For my grandparents, my grandmother still talks about the Olympics, because for her, the dream of that is almost unfathomable, right? To come where she came from, to come to America. America really accepted my family. And then 10 years later, my dad is standing on the Olympic podium as a gold medalist for the United States, where he didn't even speak English when he got here. It really, and that's why the subtitle is an unprecedented American dream. It's never really happened. It come from the shadows of the Holocaust to get to that spot. And so, it's my dad probably wouldn't talk about it with as much meaning as I do or my grandmother does, but man, incredibly meaningful.
So again, I'm sure a lot of our listeners know this, but for anyone who doesn't, your dad was, I talk about a player, 11th pick in the draft. Not many people could say that they were taken that highly after obviously a very successful career at Tennessee. Had a solid pro career. Obviously was with the Knicks. Played with Bernard King. I think that was a nice kinship that developed over the years between all the places. And then his playing career ended. And I think for a lot of guys, that's it. But he goes on to have this. I mean, it's a career that really is still going, because I know he's was last with Washington. But your dad, I'm sure he'll get, if he wants to go back, latch on somewhere else. What do you think motivated him to just keep it going and again become this person who was just so respected and renowned in his role at the Knicks, and then obviously with Milwaukee and Washington after that?
He loves the game. My dad loves the game of basketball, right? And so it's just such a passion. He's so, extraordinarily knowledgeable about every facet of it. And I think he treats people really well and always has. So, when he retired, I think the Knicks said, hey, we have an asset here, because he had opportunities to play elsewhere. But the Knicks said, this is a guy he's smart. He works hard. People really like him. He knows the game. And so he actually started announcing. They offered him a job to become a broadcaster, and he did some scouting and some coaching on the side. But which is also funny, and I reference this in the book, he came to America not speaking English, and kids made fun of him because he couldn't speak properly. And then he's announcing Knick games on the radio. So it's it really was full circle. And I just think, his command of the game, the way he treats people, he just continued to climb, and they made him an assistant coach and then an executive, and then he was a GM and president. And so I think it's really just a testament to his skill, his work ethic, and his love for the game. I mean, even to this day, we'll talk tonight, and the preseason's going, we'll talk about the preseason. He's watching, he'll know, and the cuts with my dad are so deep. It's he'll know where the guy went to high school and who his coach was and where that person played, so it really never stops. But it's really his skills, but also his love.
That's amazing to hear. And his love led to some success here in New York. Obviously he was with the team when they made the finals in '94. He assembled the entire roster that made the finals in '99. He'll always get to take credit for that. Just I think so many Knick fans, especially around our age, but even a little bit younger than us and probably older than us too, have just nothing but great memories from those '90s teams. I'm curious. You're growing up in that household, and he's kind of starting to build this franchise up. What was that like for you? I mean, what's it like to be the kid of of an NBA GM?
It's awesome, man. I mean, listen, there are two sides to every coin, and we'll get to both of them, but it's amazing. There are great perks to it. First of all, because I grew up loving the game too, so first and foremost, I get to share a love with my dad and have as much access as you could imagine to that love, right? Going to practice on the weekend, coming home, and there's Knicks players in my kitchen, which would happen, and so that part of it was amazing. Learning the game, experiencing the playoffs, getting to run around the garden, getting to shoot at the garden. These are things that every kid dreams of, and I got to do it, which is so cool. The flip side is there's a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of expectations, and kids are not always so kind about it. And, listen, when the Knicks are playing well, my dad's the smartest, best guy in the world. When they're struggling, it's not that way. This is kind of the life you live. The media is like that anyway, but the New York media is notoriously tough. And so I think growing up in that situation brings a family very close together and makes you very insular, and you kind of, you rely on each other, and you understand that, hey, you're never as good as people say you are. You're never as bad as people say you are. And for my dad, where he came from, he's an immigrant, put your head down, work, do your job. My dad's not a big talker, so he was never into the media stuff, he just kind of did his job, wanted to win, and they won a lot, and it was awesome, dude. It was awesome. Well,
other than, the stretch from the mid to late '60s to the early '70s, it's the longest sustained stretch of winning that the franchise has ever had. And it's not particularly close. And actually, if you want to get technical, it's a longer stretch, because the stretch, obviously they won 2 championships in 78, 73, but that was a little bit shorter than the run in the 90s, which, they just kept going despite different coaches. It was basically just, it was Ewing and your dad was here for pretty much all of it.
That's right.
Did you get to watch games with him ever during that time?
Always, man. Like I would go to the Garden. I would sit in the box with him. Like my mom and sister would sit down. We had seats, closer to the court, and I would sit upstairs with my dad. And yeah, I was there every step of the way, man. He always, my dad is family first, and so more so than like going to practice, it was like bring Dan to practice, just like any, how being a dad is. And
yeah, sure.
Oh man, always watching games with my dad, and great thrills, great heartbreak. We could go through all of them. Like, to this day, we talk about Game 7 in '94 in Houston, and my family was there, and yeah, exactly. There's like everyone now, like, oh God, everyone remembers, Yeah. It's the worst. It stays with you forever. But, we also remember the great times. And to your point, it was really cool because the 94 team, obviously Patrick, but you had different kind of cast of characters, John Starks, Charles Oakley, Derek Harper, but that 99 team, my dad rebuilt it, so there was Allen Houston, and, 96 was Allen Houston, Chris Childs, Larry Johnson. We had Sprewell, Camby, so you saw different iterations of the Knicks, but it was always toughness and heart. And that's what New York City is. That's what New York City basketball is. So to this day, we'll still talk about it. Like, man, if you didn't see it, the Knicks in the 90s in the Garden, you just don't know. You
could try to describe it, but because first of all, it was a different sport back then. I don't know that the sport that was played then is anything like what we see in the sport that's played now. But yeah, no, it was, the intensity, the love, the passion. You just mentioned Sprewell. Second after DeBusschere, let me make sure I'm not speaking out of turn here. I think that was the second greatest trade in Knicks history to get Latrobe. And this is no shade against John Starks. Love John Starks.
Knicks
Film School.
The best.
Big fans of John Starks, but it was Sprewell, and your dad pulled that off.
He did. And the one thing I'll say about my dad is he takes risks, calculated. He's also a data-driven thinker. So he takes all the inputs, makes a decision, but he's not afraid to take risks. And that was a huge risk at the time. And I remember that because we knew what happened with Sprewell. And
it was some PR issues.
Listen, that's a risk, but he was such a phenomenal player. And listen, my dad ultimately lost his job for that risk, because he was let go from the team in April of that year. So he didn't actually get to see the team go to he saw it, but he wasn't part of it when they went to the final. So, but he was obviously proven correct because that was a huge risk that paid off. And also it's similar with Camby, right? To trade Charles Oakley and get Camby, his career, even though Camby was the number 2 pick in the draft, his career is kind of stalled, and Oak was, of course, a fixture in the heart of the team. And so those were really gutsy moves. But that's why he's had the success he's had. He isn't afraid to take risks, and they've paid off.
I imagine for him watching the 99 run to the finals was probably a little bit bittersweet.
Very hard, man. I'll never forget it. Listen, and this goes really deep into the book. My dad DeBusschere was his favorite player. You just mentioned DeBusschere. My dad wore number 22 at Tennessee, right? It hangs in the rafters to this day. That 22 is because of DeBusschere. And my dad was blue collar, rough, and that was kind of DeBusschere's game. He was all heart. So the Knicks for my dad, he sat in the bleachers as an immigrant who couldn't speak English watching the Knicks, and just dreaming of a better life. And then he's playing for the Knicks and running the team. It's a Cinderella American dream story. So to be let go from any job, any team is hard, but the Knicks, there's a lot of intensity behind it. For me as a kid, it was of course really hard. So yeah, and I remember, it was amazing that the team did so well because obviously it proved my dad's moves right, which is great, and you want the team to do well, but to not be part of it anymore was difficult.
A couple more. You've been great, and thank you so much for the time. And I want to get back to the book one more time before I let you go. Is there one you mentioned heartbreak, glory, everything in between? Is there one memory? we could talk, Alonzo or Jeff Van Gundy hanging on Alonzo Mourning's leg, the 4-point play. Well, that was after, obviously it was the 99 run, but the missed finger roll, all of these things, the suspensions in 97. Is there something that stands out for you when you think back to the 90s, that it's the memory that comes to mind, the first one?
I think it's the Pacers series to go to the finals in 94. And, the Ewing tip dunk, that kind of that game and that ascension to taking the Knicks to the NBA finals, the elation that day was just extraordinary. Because again, anytime you have success in your job or especially with sports, it's amazing. When you do it with basketball in New York City with the Knicks, there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. So to see just to see the city on fire and to go through that with my family, that was the greatest. And, you mentioned the finger roll. I was sitting right next to my dad. I remember that game, that was the Pacers too, I think the following year. So
yes, it was.
Again, there are two sides, but so many amazing kind of triumphs and I mentioned these things in my book. I remember as a kid going to the Garden for one of these big playoff games. And I got there an hour and a half before the game. The stadium was basically full and they were already chanting defense. No one was on the floor. Doom, doom, defense. And I walked in and I was like, dude, we are ready. We are ready. And when I mean we, it was New York City. You know what I mean? It's we're ready for this.
I love it. Good times. Some heartbreak, but good times. The book, again, it's coming out soon. Pre-order now. I'm going to keep plugging it. November 16th, by the grace of the game. It seems pretty clear that you got a lot out of this. What do you hope that people who read this will get out of the book?
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, the themes of this book are relatable, right? So this is my version of a story that we all know, which is how do you overcome adversity? How do you lean on the people you love to get through, the day-to-day things we go through and ultimately succeed? So I hope people get inspiration. I hope they get joy. There's a lot of hard things in the book, but there's a lot of fun and funny things. And so, life is that way. And I really learned that from my grandma, for all the pain that she went through and the tragedy. She's the first one to tell a joke at a holiday party, the first one to laugh about things. And so the book kind of tries to reflect that. And especially for basketball fans, I hope people are entertained by how, the basketball stories and how basketball can really serve as a vehicle to take a family to places they couldn't really have imagined.
Has your grandmother read the book yet?
It's a great question. And so parts, but very small parts. So she's 96 years old. And it's actually something that I'm really nervous about. It's very hard for my dad to revisit some of this history, and so we're kind of trying to do it in phases with her because listen, her father was her hero. Like I said, my grandmother's my hero. She's also a hero. She risked her life to save people during the war. And she did that. She obtained false documents for other people. This is all detailed in the book. So she's not only my hero, she is a hero, but her hero was her father. And he was killed in Auschwitz, and I go into detail about, hey, this is the history we need to confront. What happened to Jews who were taken to Auschwitz, and so those type of details are really, it's hard for me to share that, with my grandma. And so we're being kind of careful about, doing it in doses, but she's the most supportive. She's the most proud. And, one thing is she said to me, all the time growing up, people don't know her family existed. They don't have graves to visit, so now the world will know these people existed, and there's nothing more I could ask for my grandma to know that.
That's beautifully said. I can't wait to read it. It's, and just, it's amazing that it still feels as timely to have to, remind folks that, there are some really, the world is not a great place. And you would have thought that we maybe would have come farther, but it just feels like, not to end on a dour note, but things today, I wish we had come farther, as a society. And I hope people who read this realize, anybody who maybe doesn't know the history of the Holocaust, realizes that there's just these things have continued to happen throughout history, and like hatred for people because of who they are and having nothing to do with like anything they've done. And I hope, maybe there's some positivity and some learning that comes from that angle of it as well.
Totally. And I'll modify one of the things you said. We said the world is not a great place. It's not a great place all the time.
Yeah.
You know what I think?
Yeah.
And that's really, but that's the truth of it. It's like, there's some really dark things that have happened and that can happen. And my book is ultimately a book of hope, because there's so much beauty in life. You know what I mean? And like basketball was that beauty for my family. And so my dad, he was the one who found the game, and he was so good that like it took us to these crazy places. But that's really the overarching theme is like, yeah, the world is a really tough place a lot of the time, but it's also a really beautiful place, So for me, it's always like trying to be on the right side of that and do everything you can to make sure that's the future we live.
Well said. Leave it to you to if you could be hopeful. I mean, that's all I need to hear.
That's right.
This was great. Had a lot of fun, ladies and gentlemen. One more time, Dan Grunfeld.